Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. So, I'd like to present our keynote presentation for the evening. So we welcome Dr. Jennifer Daley. So she is a research fellow at the University of Michigan Water Center. Her research interests lie in understanding how environmental stressors influence chemical exposures and the impacts this has on species and ecosystem health. Jennifer has completed Bachelor of Science at Wilfrid Laurier University and her PhD in Environmental Sciences from the Great Lakes Institute for Environmental Research at the University of Windsor. Her dissertation research on the bioaccumulation mechanism bioamplification verified over a diversity of life history traits and taxonomic groups, and looking at how multiple stressors and energetic constraints can influence chemical exposures. Wow, it's a mouthful. So we're going to be really digging into the science of microplastics. So please join me in welcoming Jennifer.
So thank you very much, Lisa, for the introduction, and thanks to the Cranbrook Institute for inviting me to speak this evening. You know, I've been really thrilled listening to the speakers before me because I can't express how important groups like this are to the health of our Great Lakes ecosystems. And so I get excited when I see people up there with smiles on their face, and you can really tell that they're enthusiastic to clean up our Great Lakes systems. So tonight's talk is going to be split up into three key areas. I'll start with plastics in the environment, move into microplastics, and finish off with microplastics in the Great Lakes. I'll be touching upon what we know at this point and what we still have to learn. So plastics include a wide range of polymeric materials. Examples include polyethylene, polypropylene. So those numbers you see on the bottom of, you know, the milk jug you have represent the type of polymer. And different items and materials require different polymers. Some need to be hard, some need to be flexible. And over the last half century, global plastic production has increased rapidly. We saw a continuous increase over these 50 years, but really it's been the last 10 years or so that plastic production is kind of soaring to new heights. And this article predicted that in 2050, we could be producing 33 billion tons of plastics a year, as opposed to now when we're producing about 0.3 billion tons. So with increased demand, you're going to have increased plastic production. But I'd be remiss if I didn't mention how important plastics are to modern society. And not just necessarily in the ways we think about it, but they've also been involved in a number of critical inventions over time. In 1970, we saw the first plastic bumpers, and these were great for kind of helping our efficiency in cars and leading to a more shock absorption in the unfortunate situation when two cars get into an accident. More recently, though, we're seeing plastic prosthetics, and these prosthetics are allowing people who require them to do so much more, and you know, that's a wonderful thing. But with an increase in plastic production, as you anticipate, there's going to be an increase of plastics in the environment. And really, it's only been over the last 5 to 10 years that the media outlets have really kind of noticed plastic pollution in the environment. A lot of this was related to the Great Garbage Patch. You might have saw the display upstairs. It touched upon this issue. There was articles that basically displayed scientists showing increased levels of plastics in the Arctic deep sea. And then there's kind of the cool terms like plastisphere, which were dubbed because they were finding new life forms on kind of the microbial communities that were growing on the surface of these plastics. And more locally, the issue of microbeads has really been kind of focused in the media the last couple of years. And a lot of that was related to the ban of microbeads in Illinois in 2014. And then whether other Great Lakes states should follow suit. So I put this quote up here because I think it really sums up kind of plastic debris in the environment. So Barnes in 2009 said the accumulation of plastic debris in nature is one of the most ubiquitous and long-lasting recent changes to the surface of our planet. And I think what he's saying is that we've produced so much plastic, and plastic we can find all over the world, that it's almost like a novel component of our environment at this point in time. Although it's a man-made component, we've introduced it in such great amounts that it's pretty much everywhere. And so the first report of plastics in the Sargasso Sea really brought to attention that plastics were ending up in places we didn't anticipate them being. But it really wasn't for a few decades that there was a big call to awareness on this garbage patch in the Pacific Ocean. And great credit goes to Captain Charles Moores and the Aguilita Foundation for bringing this to everyone's attention. And then the 5 gyres has been really significant in surveying the ocean gyres and kind of understanding what plastic debris exists in these gyres. So while plastic originates from land-based sources, it really quickly finds its way into aquatic environments. So although there are several processes that can affect plastic movement, I'll just touch upon a few. One, windblown litter, waterborne litter. We don't think about it, but ships constantly out there. And pathways include everything from kind of being suspended in the water column, sinking. Again, if these communities are growing on the surface, they're changing the density of the plastic. So we see sinking into bottom sediments. And really, sinks for plastics include everything from sediments to being ingested by organisms. And so when I look at photos like this, my first thought is, okay, that's terrifying. But perhaps my second thought is, well, that can't be here. That must be far away. But in reality, as we saw earlier this evening, it really is close to home. I was on an unrelated project this past fall on 2 major US rivers. And we took these photos because we were thinking, what the heck, like one windy night and all of this plastic is going to go back into the waterways. And that's right here. So it's definitely something that we need to pay attention to. So while those are kind of macroplastics and you could see them with the naked eye, what about microplastics? Well, this is kind of a younger science area, but they're plastic particles less than 5 millimeters. They can be primary or secondary materials. So primary materials is what you might have been hearing about in the news, microbeads, so they're in a lot of exfoliants, soaps, toothpastes, and then nurdles are pre-production materials. But we can't forget about degradation products, because a lot of large plastics end up being smaller fragments that fit into that microplastic size range. So depending on the polymer type, it can change the degradation process, but you can have weathering, mechanical breakdown, microbial breakdown, a number of ways to break down big plastics into little pieces. And so I put this slide up just to give you an idea about how we go about determining the polymer type of a microplastic. Because as you can imagine, when you have this large mucky sample, you really need to be sure that what you're looking at is a plastic. So we use this equipment to identify the polymer type to make sure it's a plastic, and then we can also use it to kind of find unique characteristics of that plastic, whether it's high density or low density. So this was a small subset of microplastics, but what we saw was most of them were polyethylene, polypropylene, or nylons, which makes sense because these dominate plastic production. And I know this is a little difficult to see, but basically this is a microbead and a microfiber. If you actually looked at the display down here, you probably saw these closer up, so it was probably better under your own scope. But the reason I put this up here was to kind of get the point across that it's very difficult to sample for microplastics, which is part of the reason why it's probably taken this long for us to really understand what's going on with these particles. Because they change in, some are really round, nice and spherical, others are highly irregular, different sizes, different types. Well, where are we finding these microplastics? Honestly, we're finding them in all the different environmental matrices. So you can find them on the water surface, mixed into the water columns, embedded in bottom sediments, beach sands. So I put this photo up here because that's a manta net or a manta trawl. And that's one of the most common ways we sample for plastics in the surface and the subsurface areas. And it's kind of nice because you can take it apart, pack it up, and bring it to your next location. But it only basically collects plastics over 0.33 millimeters. So recently there's been a number of articles that have suggested maybe we should look at more nanoplastics as well. And then the bottom two photos are ponarine, so that's how we grab for sediments. And then a lot of this involves manually checking for microplastics. You can use solvents to try to extract the rest of the muck, but you have to be careful that you don't degrade the plastic. And then the big question, what about organisms? Well, this is an area that we're definitely getting into now, but again, we're early in the stages of understanding the impacts on organisms. But what we know is that they're small enough to be taken up by a number of different types of organisms across all trophic levels. And so this was by the Agalita Foundation, but what you'll see is that from 5 millimeters to 0.3, plastics are in every container. And so these are a little bit scary, but basically I just wanted to show you that different animals can take up both macro and microplastics. So you have a bird, a fish, and then this was a limbriculus worm. Basically they wanted to show in the lab that a small worm like this could indeed take up microplastics. And as you see, those kind of fluorescent colored bulbs were indeed microplastics. So that was a study in Current Biology. And I know this is a really busy slide, but if I could draw your attention here, this study was in late 2014. And it actually reported levels the highest we've seen. So it was in the Northeast Pacific Ocean, and they found about 10,000 particles per meter cubed, so 10 particles per liter. And that's pretty significant when you think about your liter jug. But we also see studies kind of on the other end, where there's significantly lower numbers per meter cubed. Now on this list, the only Great Lakes related study was actually in a 2013 Erickson paper, which I'll get into in more detail, but it was the first published peer-reviewed article on levels in the Great Lakes. And while 466,000 particles does seem extremely high, I just want to draw your attention to kilometers squared. And also point out that this is what happens with young science. It's often difficult at the beginning to compare studies when they're done in different dimensions. So we can kind of do a rough conversion of kilometers squared to a volume, but again, these are rough conversions. And I think that's something we're learning is, we kind of need to work together to standardize our methods so we can really see how the Great Lakes compares to the Pacific Ocean. But we are finding microplastics on shorelines worldwide. So this paper basically went to shorelines on all the different continents, and indeed they found microplastics. So if you focus in on this figure here, as you might expect, the number of microplastics increased with the number of people living in a kilometer square area. And then here, it was showing mean number of microfibers from an effluent or a wastewater treatment plant effluent for kind of different items. And to be honest, most microfibers are probably coming from our own washing machines. But up until this point, most of the microplastic focus has been on marine systems. And a lot of that has to do with the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. But in the last few years, people have really started asking, well, what about freshwater systems, particularly the Great Lakes? So I think to most of us in this room, the Great Lakes are really important, and we probably all live within the Great Lakes Basin. So the Great Lakes is host to about 30 million people. It's 21% of our fresh water, and it's a substantial economic resource, so over $4 billion in fishing alone. But when you have that many people on a system, there's bound to be stressors. And the Great Lakes, unfortunately, is impacted from everything from habitat alteration, invasive species, pesticides, and then, of course, litter. This study in 2013 basically took 34 stressors and kind of grouped them into 7 core themes. And what they asked was, which areas are the most stressed? So the red is the highest stressed areas, and blue is lowest. And as you can see, you have Lake Erie, Lake Ontario. These are the highly stressed areas because they're home to a lot of people. But again, what about plastic contamination? Where does that fit when it comes to Great Lakes stressors? Well, we know that plastic debris can be found on Great Lakes shorelines. This study last year showed plastic debris on basically every sample they collected across Lake Erie shorelines. And what they saw was mostly fragments, so large plastics being broken down to smaller ones. And then kind of the next level was pellets. But again, all of their samples included plastic debris. I put this on here because I think of this as probably the first major media push when it comes to microplastics in the Great Lakes. So people were on kind of the shorelines of Lake Huron wondering what all these little white pellets were doing, and it actually was related to a nurdle spill. However, even with this article in 2010, it really wasn't until late 2012 that we started to see a lot of attention on microplastics in the Great Lakes, and significantly more in 2013 up until now. Again, most of that was related to the banning of microbeads in Illinois. So they were the very first state to ban microbeads from cosmetic products. Now, a number of companies agreed to ban these with or without statewide bans, basically, like Procter & Gamble, for one. The other articles are related to whether other Great Lakes states should follow suit. But if you kind of draw your attention to the bottom, it says, this was a month ago, it says Great Lakes are teeming with tiny plastic fibers, scientists say. And I think lately, a lot of people have been finding microfibers in their samples. And I really wanted to focus there because microplastics aren't just microbeads. We're talking microbeads, fragments, microfibers. There is a number of different microplastic particles out there. But one of the first, again, peer-reviewed studies was by Erickson et al. In 2013. And they looked at microplastics in the surface and subsurface waters on Lake Superior, Lake Huron, and Lake Erie. They found an average abundance of 43,000 particles per kilometer squared, and again, a maximum abundance over 400,000. Most of their particles were indeed pellets, or pellet-formed plastics. And they suspected they were probably from wastewater or wind-related sources. But if you kind of look at this graphic here, you can see the biggest circles are in Lake Erie. And that was where they found the highest number of plastics, which kind of follows suit with Lake Erie being a heavily impacted system. So scientists at the University of Michigan saw this article and thought, I wonder if we can predict the movement of microplastic particles in the Great Lakes. So they had actually already published articles on the current system in Lake Erie, and they took into account factors like wind stress, temperature gradients. And what they did was kind of neat. So they released particles from a wastewater treatment plant near Cleveland, and they basically for a year tracked the movement of those particles. And they tried to see if the currents in Lake Erie could basically predict where most of the plastic particles were ending up. And that's kind of what you see here. So everything flushed out of the western basin pretty quickly, and then kind of circled around the central and eastern basin. And they pointed out that 14% of these particles did escape into the Niagara River. So although they were released into Lake Erie, we are seeing them move into the rivers. And the Great Lakes in particular move pretty quickly. So movement of particles is kind of interesting in this system compared to some big oceans. Another recent study on microplastics in Great Lakes was off of St. Lawrence River. So the St. Lawrence River basically connects the Great Lakes and the Atlantic Ocean. So it's a really important water body. And they looked at microbead density in the bottom sediments at a number of sites in the St. Lawrence River. So you see quite a variation here. There's a chance most of you went to this number, which is quite large, so 136,000 microbeads in a meter squared area. So this was near a nuclear plant downstream of a wastewater effluent, but the standard error is also really big, so I'm not sure what was going on here. You know, was this a spill? I really don't know. But it's another article and basically showing that microplastics are in the Great Lakes and that we really need to do more research in this area. So we know they're there. Well, what does that mean in terms of organisms? Are they taking up plastics? This isn't a very well-studied area as of yet, but there have been a number of lab studies done. In terms of actual field studies, there's only a few right now. One being University of Michigan study looked at basically over 100 fish, 5 different species, and while they didn't find microbeads, they did find fibers in 11 to 36% of the fish. This was similar to a France study, which basically found numbers of 12% to maybe 30% fibers, and again, most of their microplastics were fibers. But this is all really early research, and we need to do more work in this area. And look at other species, look at other types of organisms. But I think the question is, if there are microplastics, if organisms can take up microplastics, what then might be the risks of microplastics? And Lambert in 2014 put together this really nice conceptual idea. So you have the microplastic, the physical contaminant, and then you have the chemical contaminants that can absorb onto the plastics. And I'll get into this a little bit later, but basically there's 2 areas that could be a risk to the organism's health. And so if we think of this in terms of the Great Lakes, this is a really rough sketch. You have, again, this physical and chemical contaminant. Your sources can be runoff, wind, wastewater treatment plant releases, accidental dumping. Exposure, it can be everything from the pelagic water, benthic sediments, shorelines. And receptors. This is an area we really need to study to understand which target organisms are coming into contact the most with microplastics. But this could be ingestion by zooplankton, who swim throughout the pelagic waters, ingestion by fishes, benthic invertebrates, a number of different possibilities here. And in terms of effects, we don't know at this point, but these are some areas that we think could be a concern if indeed organisms are taking up microplastics to a significant degree. And so the spread of alien species might seem a little bizarre up there, but the thought is, if there are these microbial communities growing on the surface of these plastics, and then plastics are flushing through the system and moving, is there a chance for movement of organisms at the same time, thereby introducing alien species? Again, at this point we don't know, but this research, we need research. So following the physical contaminant, there has been lab studies done in order to show that small organisms can take up microplastics. This was one in late 2013, and they looked at how the uptake of microplastics changed the energetic reserves of that worm. And so there was a 30% decrease in energy reserves in worms from a 1% by weight microplastic ingestion. And again, this was a lab study, but what that shows is there might be an issue with starvation if there's that substantial of a decrease in energy reserves. But again, we need to do field validations to see what this looks like at environmental concentrations. And then the chemical contaminant. Well, I think it was kind of this quote that really drew people's attention to the possibility of microplastics interacting with chemicals in the environment. And so NOAA said plastic debris accumulates pollutants such as PCBs up to 100,000 to 1 million times levels found in seawater. And so PCBs are kind of a legacy contaminant. They're definitely here in the Great Lakes. They've been banned for several decades, but they're one of those contaminants that just won't go away. And so at this point, the literature tells us that plastics can absorb and concentrate pollutants. Degraded plastics can leach chemical additives, bisphenol A, phthalates, flame retardants. So now we know that plastics can indeed absorb or leach chemicals, but the next question is, what does that mean in terms of secondary impacts to organisms compared to other sources? So this figure here basically was a study that looked at beached plastic pellets, and they did show PCBs absorbed to the plastics kind of throughout the world. So if chemicals are on the plastics, is this a real source for increased POPs and additive introduction to the food web? Well, some research suggests plastics do increase the exposure of aquatic organisms to chemicals associated with the plastics. Roachman et al., 2013. So this study by Brown basically showed that microplastic moves pollutants and additives to worms, reducing functions of the worm. So these are two graphs showing PBDE and triclosan. Triclosan is kind of a common, it's in a lot of hand sanitizers, and it's kind of a personal care product. And what they wanted to see in the lab was if there was a chemical absorbed onto the plastic, could it then be taken up into the gut? And as you see here, it was indeed taken up into the gut. But again, the purpose of most of these early studies was to see whether the transfer of contaminants was possible, and then also to use contaminated plastics and relatively clean organisms to really see kind of the signature of the chemical moving through the organism. But researchers at the same time who kind of model contaminants like PCBs asked if these contaminants would be as big of an impact compared to, say, food and other sources where they're finding these same chemicals. And his early modeling work didn't show necessarily that the uptake of these contaminants from plastic was any more than what they were going to be exposed to in a contaminated environment. But the authors were quick to point out that there's a real need to validate these models in the field and at realistic exposure concentrations. Something else the study pointed out was, again, nobody's really looking at nanoplastics. And with nanoplastics, you have an increased surface area for these chemicals to absorb onto, and that might be an area of concern. So we should probably start thinking about plastics not just stopping at 0.33 millimeters, but also looking at the really small ranged microplastics. And I guess that kind of brings me to this question. What is sufficient data when it comes to a potential threat? Well, when it comes to the physical contaminant, the microplastic, and the chemical sorbedon, at this point, the science is very young, and we really need to continue to push to do great research in order to answer some of these questions. And that falls in line with the US EPA stressor impairment list. So the US EPA has ranked kind of these issues as being the biggest issues across the US. Everything from pathogens, PCBs, mercury. Well, I think that leads us to ask, where do we rank microplastics? In order to rank microplastics and for us to really understand what's going on in the Great Lakes, we need to do thorough risk assessments. And in order to do these risk assessments, we need more research. So you want to have evidence-based decision-making, which makes it necessary to kind of define ecological exposures, effects, and risks, understand the range of exposures and variability. We need to know what are the target receptors in the Great Lakes. What are the organisms we should be focusing on? And I put this in here because with kind of young science, oftentimes it's beneficial to look at other areas of science like engineered nanoparticles and mixture chemistry to kind of lead us in a direction so that we have focus areas to do our research. And some of those directions I can see in the future would be understanding the types of microplastics that are the biggest current threat. Is this microbeads, microfibers, fragments? What is the risk of exposure to Great Lakes organisms? What does realistic environmental concentrations mean? Do exposures result in adverse impacts to organisms? What is the role of sediments? And what are the primary sources of exposure? I saw cigarettes up there on one of the earlier talks. Wastewater treatment plant outfalls, what are the sources? And again, what's the most likely exposure route from sediments? And how do microplastic risks compare or interact with other co-occurring stressors? Especially in areas like the Great Lakes, which are stressed by a number of different issues. Well, I think we need the research to answer these questions. At the University of Michigan, we've kind of formed a research platform with ecotoxicologists, chemists, biologists, social scientists to try to address some of the questions we have on microplastics in the Great Lakes. It's cross-disciplinary, multi-scale. We're hoping that this is a long-lasting platform. Some of the questions we're asking are about food web dynamics, physical characterizations of the plastic, source tracking, fate, understanding environmental health, and lastly, standardizing methods, because it really is important that we have a good idea of what the best methods are for sampling microplastics. But I should add that there are a number of other groups in the US and worldwide doing critical microplastic research right now. And with that, I'll say thank you, and thank you so much for being here. And remember, we can all help.
Wastewater treatment plants test for microplastics?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And so wastewater treatment plants in general are variable, so they use different methods. Some of the methods that large wastewater treatment plants, there is like a sinking element, so some of these plastics would go with that. But a number of these plastics are still escaping, so it's pretty variable from wastewater treatment plant to wastewater treatment plant. But I mean, it's a really great question because perhaps it's a conversation we need to have with these utilities just to understand what they're doing in order to identify possible plastic pollution. Yes?
They mentioned the water bottles a lot, and I know, like, I think in Europe and some like place like Whole Foods banned the plastic bags, but some people proactive carry their own bags, grocery shopping, but for the most part, you know, Myers just program stands out double bags. So, are those readily broken down like into the tiny parts first, or do they? I know they clog up, you know, sea turtles and that.
Mm-hmm.
But how are they breaking down faster than the other everything else? You think the way?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. So, as you said, macroplastics, we know a lot about the impacts that it can have on organisms. You know, it's quite scary when you see a sea turtle taking up a plastic bag. But with plastic bags, they kind of usually rip apart first, and this is dependent on the type of plastic bag from the store, but they'll rip apart and then eventually get down to these little pieces. And again, with plastic bags, they're fragments, so they're often difficult to identify in the really, really small sizes simply because they look so irregular. But I would say plastic bags, much like most polymers, can indeed break down. Yeah, but it's usually the ripping from logs that causes that breakdown.
So the microbeads are not being caught, or the microplastics are not being caught out of the water treatment plants. Are they being caught at the drinking water end of things?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I should first say some of them are being caught, absolutely, because the number, especially with fibers, I mean, the number that we're actually releasing is incredible. But at the drinking water system, they're caught more, especially because the filters are a lot smaller. So when you're talking about the filters for drinking water, they're really, really, really protective on drinking water. So a lot of these particles will be caught. I can't speak to the really, really small particles yet, which is, you know, a great question. But from what I understand, most of the drinking water, it would have to be pretty small to get through. Yeah.
Is there anything you can do to help about microfibers?
That's a really good question. I'm not sure at this point. So we just actually started looking at materials, and because, you know, not everything's made the same, and, you know, whether some are releasing more fibers, I'm not really sure at this point, and I wouldn't be the right person to kind of give you guidance in that area, but it's a good question, and I hope that somebody can address it for us.
It's people are starting to wear more and more plastic clothes. I mean, more and more.
Oh, yes. You mean to go back to, yeah, away from plastics.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, that might be a good direction.
Yes.
You talked about how difficult it is to actually, when you have this muck and you're looking to find the microplastics, to identify them all, and you just talked about how nanoplastics may be a huge issue as well, even though you can't. It's even harder to identify something so small. Is there any game plan to where you will be able to identify and find these nanoplastics that are in sediment or in
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So I think with nanoplastics, some of it has to be in the lab. So first we have to understand what kind of filters we need in order to pick them up in the fields. So again, most nets only go down to 0.33 millimeters, so of course we're not going to be picking up a lot of stuff that's fitting through the net. But with that, there are a number of people that are starting to look at methods for nanoplastics and different kind of solvent extractions, because when you get rid of the muck, it's a lot easier to pick up the plastic. So it's just going to take time. But there are researchers definitely looking into that, because I mean, a number of the papers I read, you know, kind of suggest that maybe we should start looking at nanoplastics. Yep.
This question about like, I guess styrofoam, styrofoam.
Mm-hmm.
You find out whatever some of it's different,
Yeah, so styrofoam's interesting because it's a little bit more floaty. So I know sometimes when I'm working with styrofoam, I'll bring pieces home. So it kind of behaves slightly different, but I mean, certainly they're looking for styrofoam when they're going through their manual search. Yes?
So what specific research is being done on the effect of the
Nanoparticles or micro? Okay, yes.
I guess both.
Okay, so most of the literature at this point has been done in a lab. So there's been a call for kind of the next steps to start looking at realistic field exposures. And other than a few of the stomach gut content analyses you saw, and there's been some invertebrate type studies, that's pretty much all I know at this point. But I know there are a lot of groups currently doing it right now. So I'm hoping in the next 2 years we'll know a lot more. Yeah. Yes?
One of the early slides you had talked about how the growth in plastics in Europe is so much lower than the growth in plastics in, say, North America.
Mm-hmm.
Is that correlated to anything, like the efforts in Germany to have incentives to recycle and the restrictions that they have on packaging there?
Well, I mean, geez, that's an excellent question. So I don't know about the European study that was up there. I don't know the specifics of why they were so low. I mean, there are North American studies that are areas where they found low items as well. But I guess on that same topic, one of the speakers tonight reminded me of a study I read that was on a Chicago beach. And the number of microplastics was actually really low. And at first it really didn't connect, but this evening when you were talking about the cleanup, I think it was Sarah, it made me realize that maybe that's why the number was so low. Maybe they're just very good at picking up the bigger plastics, not giving them a chance to break down, and I think that speaks volumes to, you know, maybe how we should proceed in the future. And I think you're probably onto something with that. I know a lot of European countries are quite strict when it comes to plastic pollution, but I don't know the specifics of that article. Yes?
Have there been any international laws about dumping from ships?
Yes, there are international laws. I don't know how well they're followed, but there are laws about dumping in general, including dumping plastics. Yeah.
Like our military is doing that.
Yes.
I don't know, they still make it. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know too much about it, but like I said, I mean, unfortunately, there's also a lot of issues in the oceans with kind of who owns, or not owns, but you know, like where the borders lie. And so, I mean, there's been reports of people doing that right outside of the border, and you can't really track for stuff that's not there. But I mean, it's a good question, and I don't really know at this point. Yeah, it's a good comment. Yes?
I found this very interesting tonight. I'm trying to place it in the overall picture. There are other things that are floating, for instance, sand, dirt, pollen.
Yes.
There are all kinds of things in the air that will end up in the water.
Yes.
What percentage of microplastics and microbeads make the overall dumping in the ocean of nano pieces?
I don't know, but I can say right now we're actually trying to figure out what percentage of microplastics there is in relation to, say, algae, because we know there's, you know, tons of algae in our system, and it's a difficult question, one that we need though to do risk assessments. And you brought up an excellent point. You know, when it comes to total particles, we really need to know what that means in terms of volume of water. Because if an organism isn't actually coming in contact with the microplastic, but it's coming in contact with all this other stuff, then, you know, maybe the risk isn't as high, and then vice versa. So we don't really know at this point, but you know, it's a good question. Yeah. Yes.
So, as you've done in the lab, where's it going to lead to? You said in a couple of years you're hoping that the field study show you conclusive evidence. So we're going to take that evidence and do what with it? We're going to say that maybe we should have laws stating that all plastics should have maybe a recyclable value.
Yeah, okay, so I mean worldwide too. Like, I'm hoping that there's all kinds of labs looking into realistic environmental concentrations. And I think what we do with the information is going to depend on what we see. And that's why at all stages we like to keep environmental health risk assessors, social scientists, all of these different people involved, in order to make suggestions on, so we have the results and they can suggest maybe what we need to do with those results. So I don't know what that's going to mean, but you know, at the end of the day, I hope that our recycling laws are stricter regardless of what we find out, because we know macroplastics are a problem. But perhaps this research, you know, will lead to kind of more informed and better decision making in the future with plastic pollution. Yes?
I'm just curious, has there been any pushback from particular industries? I know you said like Procter & Gamble has decided to cooperate before the states decide to act. So are there any industries that are kind of trying to fight this research or lobby against it for their benefit?
Yeah, I don't know necessarily if they're publicized because, you know, that would be relatively bad press. But I think what's going on right now is that there are industries that are asking the question, are you sure it's us? Because, you know, even when it comes to microbeads or microfibers, there are a number of products and items that have these in them. So I think one of the pushbacks that we're getting, and rightfully so, is they're saying, well, listen, are you sure it's our cream that's the problem? Because if it isn't our cream, maybe you should be talking to them. And, you know, I don't know the details of this because I'm not kind of in the law area, but yeah, I think that's the question they're asking, and you know, we need the science in order to answer that question for them. So, and part of that has to do with source tracking. You know, it would be great if we can understand sources, and if there is a way to kind of do source tracking back to the company, it's very difficult, but it would be great for us to, you know, kind of discuss with them why or why not their company might need to look into changes. Yes?
Are you aware of the reason publicly facing that Procter & Gamble did give for making the ban themselves?
I'm not really aware of the details. I should also say there's a number of other companies than just Procter & Gamble. Yeah, but I think, yeah, I can't really comment on that because I'm not sure. Sometimes it honestly has to do with media attention, you know, and them being scared of the future. A lot of companies, I mean, my background actually is in legacy contaminants, and you know, we found out late that a lot of those chemicals they were using were really bad, and you know, now we have stricter laws in place to try to avoid that from ever happening again. So in 50 years from now, we don't, you know, have all these new chemicals there. So I think that's part of it, is learning. I hope, you know, they're learning from the past, and I think they really are. So, yes.
I think one of the biggest things we can do is all of us, just people we know. Are these slides available, for instance, that we could access and show our friends?
This is a great one.
Oh, yeah.
Presentation's helpful because we have you available maybe on. Yeah, actually, I'd like to thank Daley, our AD tech here at Cranbrook Institute of Science, who has been recording this presentation, and it'll be available on Cranbrook's YouTube stream. So definitely be accessible. So you can find that by looking at our website. We won't have people's voices who are asking the questions, but we will have all of Dr. Daly's comments.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
One of my pet peeves is the plastic silverware. I can use it over and over again until it's almost fall apart, but it doesn't fall apart actually. And it just gets thrown out at restaurants, and where I work, they use all styrofoam cups. And, you know, I bring my own cup or bottle before I try to tell people. Some people have, you know, we're buying them for gifts for each other at Christmas, with plastic cups, but there's so much plastic. It's driving me crazy. They're pretty hardy. They end up in the ocean probably.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Eventually everything kind of breaks down. Again, although someone did make a good point, they don't just disappear. That would be wonderful, but you know, it takes a long time for them to break down. But I mean, even the big pieces, the plastic fork is definitely a danger to a lot of, you know, possible target receptors. So that's a great point. And going back to your point as well, I think that's an excellent point and something that we should all keep in mind. So thank you both for bringing that up. All right, well, thank you very much.
Thanks so much for your time here this evening. We hope to see you back at the Institute again soon. Have a lovely weekend.